Parliament?
Yes, yeah.
Very good. Now, I was hoping that we might get some more, and you sometimes, have, there's a lot going on. That there hasn't been enough public discussion about this in other parts of the world. I want to make it very clear to those of you for whom this is a very painful issue that I'm not going to deal with the territorial matters. That is not the purpose of this meeting. Hello, how wonderful, Sayeeda, how great Baroness Sayeeda, please, of our discussing this and considering ways in which this can be brought to a wider public attention, and to see whether there aren't ways in which pressure can be brought to bear on those who are perpetrating human rights abuses. Now, there have been serious serious civil and political unrest in the region, and we who are sitting in this room know about it. And according to the Jammu and Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, approximately 160 civilians have been killed in, I think that was 2018 into 2019. And that was the highest number in a decade. So we're seeing an escalation of the numbers of civilians who are being killed and who are disappearing and who are being put into prison and who are suffering violence in the course of this conflict. Despite the high numbers of civilian deaths, there's very little information on any new investigation into the excessive use of force leading to casualties. One of the things that I was very grateful to receive some of the documentation that has currently been compiled about, for example, the use of pellet-firing shotguns, and how we have now a record coming from the Maharaja Hari Singh Hospital in the capital city of Srinagar. 1,459 people blinded by the use of metal pellets in the last 3 years. I mean, it's a shocking number. And then, of course, there is this really unpleasant and vile business of cordon and search operations. People tend not to know what that means, but it means that the security forces go into a village, get all the men folk in the village to come out into the street, and then they bring hooded persons who are in custody and who are informing, and get them to point out people whom they say are offenders against the state. And this is a strategy which I have to say dates back to, I'm afraid, the Second World War. It's been highly criticised around the world, and it's been reintroduced into the Valley in 2017 and been taking place since. Assault, arbitrary and unlawful detention, collective punishment, and the destruction often of their homes. And so it's a sort of itself. So I'm going to invite my colleagues to speak on the subjects of arbitrary detention, about the Special Powers Act, which is being used, which gives an impunity for human rights violations. I'm very concerned, and I spoke in the House yesterday where there was a question being asked about Kashmir, and I asked about the internet shutdowns. Because India currently is leading the world in the maximum number of internet shutdowns that they authorise, and it's not going to surprise you that the state of Jammu and Kashmir remains the epicenter of those blackouts, and there's currently there's a blackout taking place. And what that means is that people then do not know what is going on in their world. They don't know the extent to which there are human rights abuses. They're without information. Information is empowering and is necessary for people to challenge abuses of authority. Human rights abuses in this region are really serious, and we wanted to have a discussion about that in this House on this occasion, and I'm very grateful to have such a distinguished panel. And I'm going to introduce you immediately to Maleeka Bukhari, who is the Parliamentary Secretary in the Ministry of, please take a seat, in the Ministry of Law and Justice, and she is a friend of mine and someone who studied law here in Britain, and it was wonderful to see that she has taken office in Pakistan, and that she will bring, I think, her great values to bear on some of these issues.
What you see today, actually, and I think focuses on what happened after the unilateral and illegal decision by the Indian government on 5th of August. And today is the 178th day, and the 8 million Kashmiri population is under siege of India over there. And during this siege, they have been denied access to medical facility, they have been denied access to, there has been shortage of food, there has been shortage of medicine. People who were terminally ill, they were supposed to be getting the therapies or the medical attention according to information that has reached us, and I think many other people. And those people, they have died because of non-availability of the medical facility. There, I have checked with the British media. Steve, last time when I gave the briefing to the parliamentarians, Steve raised the issue with me whether I have approached the British media or not. I did a number of times, and every time I approached them, they have said that they do not have any access to Indian Occupied Kashmir to see the situation on the ground, which means not only that they are carrying out the atrocities behind the, this blackout, but they are also actually denying the press freedom. So I think they are violating on many counts. Now, everybody is, has a consensus that we should be talking about human rights violations. Yes, that is the major issue. Although there are other aspects related to it, like as Baroness Warsi very rightly said, that unless there is a political solution to that, you cannot be. This will continue. This life of Kashmiris will continue. We will do it on some other forum because you want to focus on human rights situation. But there is another very important aspect related to the Kashmir issue, and that is the security of the region. Because what does not figure in the newspapers or would not reach to each and every parliamentarian and the person who is concerned about as to what's going on in that part of the world is the tension that has been heightened by India, and by way of violation of LOC. There have been more than 5,000 ceasefire violations. There have been more than 5,000 ceasefire violations. And those ceasefire violations are not just violations. That is also taking its toll on the human lives on that side of the LOC, which means people in Azad Jammu and Kashmir are also dying as a result of the crossfire and the violation of the LOC. Now, people have talked about a lot in many ways that human rights violation, but I think my suggestion would be that we must focus on the documented accounts. I had a very good discussion with Baroness Kennedy on this. You would like to share with you, or you would like to share with them. You mentioned about the Palestinian victims. There is an Amnesty International report on this. It's a 112-page report, which cites 88 cases of those who have been blinded.
It was shocking. You gave it to me and I was shocked.
That is just 88 cases. We are looking at more than 11,000 victims of Palestinians, and we are looking at more than 1,400 those who have been blinded because they cannot use of Palestinians. And every day, every minute of the day, they see their children who have been blinded because of the Palestinians. Then there is another very important aspect which surfaced in 2009, because there is an association of parents of disappeared persons, and these people are those group of people who are looking for their children who have been missing for ages now. Ages means that it's been many years and their whereabouts are not known to anybody. And there had been occasions when India responded rarely to the advocates over there, or advocacy of human rights over there in Indian Occupied Kashmir, and they came back and they said that, look, these were we would kill those who would come from across the LOC, we would arrest them and we would bury them. Because these association of disappeared persons parents, they actually discovered 9,000 mass graves. 9,000. And they were hugely supportive. There's another 112-page report which was filed in 2009, and that was actually, the work was done by the International People's Tribunal. this is an NGO based in Indian Occupied Kashmir. And this tribunal discovered almost 3,000 mass graves, where in each mass grave there were more than, starting from 3 to 17 bodies in each grave. And when they actually took up this matter with the international community, India said that these are the people who crossed the NOC and they were killed in encounters. And it so happened that they picked up 50 graves, mass graves, and they exhumed those bodies, and the identification, physical identification and DNA test was carried out. And in 49 of the mass grave cases, it turned out that they were all local residents, those who were missing actually, about whom the parents had actually filed their FIR or the reports with the police. So they were not only guilty of lying about infiltration from across LOC, but they are also they committed crime against humanity by way of killing these innocent people in fake encounters. The civil society who have gone there voluntarily to check the situation on ground, and they have been providing information to the media, and media have been quoting them, but they have also filed their own reports. According to them, when they met the parents, after even just a few days before, because India knew that 5th August they are going to take this action, unilateral action. So they started arresting people, picking up young Kashmiris with whom they had this fear that they will be out on the street, they will create some problem. So they actually took them in custody. As many as 13,000, according to 2 reports, voluntary reports, as many as 13,000 young Kashmiris have been taken away from their homes, and their whereabouts are not known, their welfare is not known, their parents. And given the track record of the Indian forces, what might have happened to them, I have just referred to mass graves. These people who are today missing, they might land up another bunch of mass graves in the times to come. So this is nothing that we do not expect.
Then we must refer to these documents. They had been mass raped also. If you might have heard about Qurban Hussain, there were 2 villages where the Indian security forces or Indian occupation forces, they surrounded those villages. They took out the men from there in 1991. After 28 years, almost 29 years now, none of them got any relief, none of them got any justice actually. So there is a documented account of Qurban Hussain mass rape as well.
There is a documented account of that, what the documents that I have got, and none of the documents are prepared by the government of Pakistan or any Pakistani. These are the documents which have been prepared by independent organizations or the individuals who were volunteer. So there is a whole account of that. Nobody talks about the demographic change, because all the mass killings, all the perpetual genocide which has taken place, and the fear that has been created to make people run away from there, or maybe people have been expelled by force from out of Jammu and Kashmir. That is all part of the strategy to bring about the change in demography of that region.
Kill the young.
Yeah, kill the young.
Get them to move, get them to
Yes. So we have written to it is on record. There is a UN document on this, which we wrote to the UN Secretary General, and he circulated that document. I have actually got that document also, so that you have a full insight into what all measures other than mass killings, genocide, and forceful expulsions, what all other measures India has taken to actually bring about the demographic change. And that is the most worrying part of it, because nobody talks about it, nobody knows has any information about it. You will find all these things on Pakistan High Commission's website, but these are also available, or these documents are also available online as well. Of the UN Security Council resolutions on Kashmir, because those resolutions, they consider Kashmir to be a dispute, and it is an internationally recognized dispute. It is not really up to Pakistan and India to sit bilaterally and resolve it. We have seen it for ages, and we have come to realize that India would never give way to bilateral dialogue so that we could reach any conclusion. It is my earnest request, it is the request of the government of Pakistan to the international community. It's high time that the international community must play its role, must intervene, must stop the bloodshed which is going on.
So High Commissioner, what would you be, when you say the international community should be doing this, what are the steps that should be taken towards that?
Yes.
Are you talking about having peacekeeping forces put in there? What are you describing to us?
But we also see what next can be done is the immediate intervention of the international community to stop the humanitarian crisis which is going on. And how can they do that? There has been outstanding demand by the UN High Commissioner. Twice he asked for fact-finding mission to be sent to Indian Occupied Kashmir. Twice APBG on Kashmir, the UK, they asked for it. Twice international, independent permanent human rights commissioner OIC asked for sending the peace mission to them. Pakistan agreed, and Pakistan actually allowed the APBG on Kashmir to go to Pakistan. They have been there. The OIC fact-finding mission has been there to Pakistan side to the KJK. I heard my friend that you intend to go to Pakistan. We welcome your visit to Pakistan again. When you go there, I would suggest, and I would also recommend to the government of Pakistan, that you meet those people who are actually the victim of the LOC ceasefire violations. Not only victim of the mortar bombings they do, but also victim of the cluster ammunition they have used. India actually keeps on organizing conducting work. You'll never get to know the reality on ground.
If I could just add that we have previously requested when we did our report as an all-party parliamentary group on Kashmir, and we were denied. There was no invitation from the Indian Occupied Kashmir side. We've now requested that again. I'm planning a visit in February of this year. And the Pakistani government has been very open as always, and we are awaiting the Indian response.
May I just, because you referred to some of the conventions, I just want to name these conventions.
Well, I've got an expert on that who's going to come into this. So let's have international law being dealt with by Schona Jolly. This really is her.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you very much for raising the voice for the voiceless Kashmiris. I hope that we meet again in a bigger gathering, and inshallah, I would do my best to see that we have a bigger gathering to
that would be excellent.
Bigger voice.
Now, I'm going to ask you, Maleeka Bukhari, to just give us basically your concerns about this.
Baroness Kennedy, Baroness Helena QC, High Commissioner, esteemed members of the House of Lords and House of Commons, a very good evening to all of you. I have travelled all the way from Pakistan to be here today to bring attention to this very important matter, a very tragic issue actually, of widespread human rights violations that the people of Indian Occupied Jammu and Kashmir are experiencing over the last 7 decades, but it has been exacerbated after the illegal annexation of India into a disputed territory, essentially, under the UNSC resolutions. And as all the members of Parliament, not here right now, have pointed out, that the systematic abuse that is taking place in Indian Occupied Jammu and Kashmir is in violation of, it's not a bilateral issue because it's in complete contravention of international human rights law principle. That the people of an area are under siege for 170 days, 8 million people. I believe that the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir area is now the largest open air prison on the planet, essentially. And the comments that are coming out of and the statements that the members of Parliament are making from India and the abuse that women and young girls are suffering within Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir is probably the worst form of sexual violence. The rape victims and victims of molestation range from age 8 to 60 years of age, and that's a very, very broad age gap. And of course, as a member of Parliament and also as a lawyer, I believe that the internet shutdown, the complete internet shutdown that is taking place and the communication blockade that is taking place in occupied Jammu and Kashmir again was highlighted by the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression, and they echoed the concerns that I am relaying to you here today, that it is unacceptable in any democracy or in any area or under any principle of international law that you for 170 days block complete access of communication to citizens of an area. And I don't think it finds any precedent under international law or international humanitarian law or under the Constitution of India. In fact, the illegal annexation has been cited to be in contravention of the principles of the Constitution of India. So that is a major concern for me as a member of Parliament. I also believe that the widespread torture that is taking place in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, again, is a violation and contravention of international human rights principles. It is a violation of the rights of the Kashmiris. And there is mass murder, and there is rape, and there is torture and degrading treatment. And that has been ongoing for almost 7 decades now, but it was exacerbated by the events of 5th of August. And there is no international observer or independent human rights organization that can go to Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir and verify what is taking place. It is completely shut down to the global community, and as a Pakistani member of Parliament, I have huge concerns with that, and it of course violates many principles of international human rights law. And the ICCPR convention that India is party to and has ratified a long time ago. So, of course, there is a lot happening in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir that should be a cause of concern to everybody, especially those on the other side of the border. And the last point that I want to touch on is freedom of religion. There is mass reports of a complete clampdown on the rights of the people of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir to be able to exercise their right to practice their religion freely. There was a procession in a holy month called Muharram, and people were not allowed to participate in it. People were not allowed to participate in Eid prayers, not allowed to participate on Friday prayers, which are essential part of any Muslim's life, any practicing Muslim's life. So obviously, again, violation of international human rights principles on freedom of religion, and unheard of prior to this. So essentially, I am here today to...
I wanted to ask you, I mean, do we feel that we're seeing a sort of gear change, that it actually is moving to a different level of outrage?
I believe so. I think that, like Baroness Warsi pointed out, that there is now a legal justification for the mass human rights violations that are taking place in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Prior to this, it was a dispute between both countries, and yes, they were trying to resolve it, but now it has a legal justification and legal cover, and it is going into a direction which is alarming, which is tragic,
because of taking
and the
their
trajectory
powers
is very difficult for anybody to absorb, let alone any member of Parliament in any democracy across the country, across the global community. And I think you asked what we want members of Parliament within the United Kingdom
And
to do.
what would you want the international community to do? I mean, you paid tribute to me as a fierce human rights lawyer. You were one of my smartest pupils I ever had, Maleeka. And I want to know what is it you want to see lawyers around the world, for example, parliamentarians, and those who have concerns about human rights abuses. What is it you want to see?
So I think first of all, lawyers across the United Kingdom should call for intervention of international observers, international journalists, and human rights organizations to go into Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir and take a real account of what is happening.
A fact-finding mission.
Absolutely. And then the UN Charter, under the auspices of the UN Charter, there are important articles that provide a legal way forward for lawyers to, and for states. I think the important job for you, unfortunately, is to convince the government of the United Kingdom to take a principled stance on this issue. Because within the UN Charter, for example, Article 90 of this additional protocol on the 4th Geneva Convention has established an international human rights fact-finding commission. Now that can be put into place again, and the government of Britain can do that. You know, they can essentially push for it to be established again or reinvigorated with regards to the human rights abuses in the occupied Jammu and Kashmir.
Can I just ask another question with regards to this? Any independent
fact-finding
mission in presence of so heavily populated militarized zone, people are so fearful. Do you think you will get the true picture from them? Because let me give you an example. Over the history we have seen when there has been some relaxation and the people have come to the other side and to meet their relatives. And I actually met some who came from the other side of line of control in the Punch district. What they were telling us, the military has one person sitting on a rooftop of every house at night. Every house in that village has a military man standing on their rooftop, and any visitor that comes to the area, they have to report it to the police who they are, and without police permission, they can't even house a visitor in their house, a guest in their house. Now, under those circumstances, any outside mission, is it going to get a real picture from the people? I think one of the things which I would say, because what I must add, is that any time, if any foreign person or visitor has been in the area, those people who they have met, they have been called upon by the army in their camps and debriefed. Okay, what was said? Who said what, and all the rest of it. And they try to catch them out. Intimidate them. So this is my fear. Are we going to add? Whether this something will come out of it or not, that is to see later. But are we going to add to their problems by having army there and then talking to them, and then when you come out, the problems are actually doubled on them in terms of intimidation. That was the question that I had.
Yes, of course.
Remember when he went to Yugoslavia, he didn't go with any protocol, he broke the visa system, he just went in and saw the plight of the people, and it was on our TV screens and changed what happened next. This is a problem that politicians have to get their head around. And really, it's not about the Labour Party, the Tory Party, or the Liberal Democrat Party, whichever party it is. It's about human rights violations. This is played in the politics of my city in Leicester. It's played in politics across the country. People on the doorstep. We're talking about what's happening in India and Pakistan. So it matters here. But we should not get involved in the politics. We should concentrate on the human rights abuses. And I would say, if, I don't know whether anybody reads them, you were talking about somebody getting blinded, so many people getting blinded. There was a story in the Leicester paper, it made the headlines. A motorcyclist got blinded by somebody throwing an egg in his eye, and one eye, he lost the eyesight on one eye. And it was in the papers, it was on the TV. You're talking about hundreds of cases here. And the reality is, if you ever see any manufacturer, any retailer in the UK, they have to go back to their supply chain and be at the factory in India, Bangladesh, or wherever it might be, to make sure that the workers' rights are adhered to and the health and safety rights are adhered to. And we're ignoring millions of people in the population. So people like Marks and Spencer's or Primark and everybody else can do a better job than a government. And we're talking not about their working conditions, their living conditions and the way they are there. My suggestion would be, it shouldn't be an observation visit for a day or 2 days. There should be a permanent place for them, because you can hide one day, you can hide everything for 2 days, or you can change everything for 2 days. You can't change it for the rest of their life. There needs to be constant observation.
You remember that Paddy Ashdown, when he went to...
You see, it's
not a bilateral thing. It is, the UN Security Council has held 3 meetings since 5th August, which means there is some...
Who has?
UN Security Council.
UN Security Council. And so there hasn't been any debriefing of them?
There had been a debriefing. So there actually nothing came out because, you see, it was a closed door meeting. There was just a statement that we held a meeting and we actually discussed the situation on ground over there and expressed concern on all these things.
This was a
You see, the problem you have is so easy for everybody just to say, oh, it's fake news. Because nobody has got that actually.
Well, you close down you put a wall around it. I'm going to turn to Schona. And so Schona has great experience as a lawyer. I know that this is one of the issues that you had taken a position on. The Bar Council has made statements. Your recommendations, your appraisal of how international law impacts on this and what we might do.
Okay. So I'm chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales, which is an independent body of the Bar Council, but we work with the Bar Council. In November, we wrote a joint letter to Prime Minister Modi on our concerns about the rule of law, on our concerns about detentions of lawyers, of judges, of political people within Kashmir, and of course ordinary citizens. We wrote with our concerns about the PSA, we wrote with our concerns that lawyers were being prosecuted, were completely unable to do their job, that the rule of law was coming to a halt, or had come to a halt in Kashmir, not just because lawyers were being prevented from doing their job, but also because the court system can't function when you have a transport system that can't function, when you have information that doesn't function, and effectively the courts had come to an end in a situation where there was a lockdown and crisis of a vast scale. The fact that the courts aren't functioning is a hugely problematic issue. So if you take, for example, habeas corpus, the right to come before a court when someone's been detained, that couldn't happen in Kashmir because the courts were effectively closed down. And so they have to come to Delhi, and that's another story. So the chair of the Bar Council, who was then Richard Atkins QC, and I wrote a letter to Prime Minister Modi. That letter came on the back of a really significant event that the Bar Human Rights Committee did at the end of October, with a number of speakers, which was sold out and more. A waitlist was like a waitlist I've never had really in this country for an event of that kind, where we had people like Mirza Wahid speaking, Natasha Cowell, Gautam Bhatia, who's one of the lawyers in the Article 370 cases, and other British journalists as well who were in attendance. So we have noticed that there is a huge interest. That event was sold out. We have parliamentarians coming to the event even though it was in the middle of a constitutional crisis in this country as well at the time. So I would say, first of all, that there is interest broadly in the issue, and actually today doesn't really represent that. There are all kinds of reasons why today is slightly thin on the ground, but doesn't really represent that there is a real interest in this issue. There are a couple of things that I really want to talk to you about, and I know time is limited. People have talked about international law a little bit already, so I'm perhaps going to just say a few words on international law. But what I'd really like to do in the time available to you is talk to you about the UN position and why I think it's important in terms of any recommendations, and also talk to you about the domestic position, because this conversation has taken place in a little bit of a vacuum because it hasn't really reflected on the huge amount of work taking place in India to try to counter these issues. And I don't think you can completely divorce the issue of Kashmir from the issue of the Citizenship Amendment Act, the National Register of Citizens, which we've already seen taking place in Assam province, in the state of Assam, and in fact, which has resulted in millions taking to the streets in a pretty unprecedented way for the first time since independence in the streets of India. So I don't think that these issues are completely disconnected. I haven't got the time to join all the dots for you this evening. But I want to just give you a flavour of that. I think most people here will know this, but India is of course a signatory to the ICCPR. And because it's a state party to that convention, India is obliged to follow the principles of legality and the right to liberty and security. And that includes the right not to be subjected to arbitrary arrest and detention. Now we know that thousands upon thousands of mostly men, but also women, have been arbitrarily arrested and detained, not just since last August, but in fact in the decades before as well. There's a range of provisions within the ICCPR on the right to freedom of expression, assembly, the right to life, freedom from torture, etc. And whilst Article 19.3 of the Covenant does allow states to impose restrictions on certain grounds which include the protection of public order and security, the Human Rights Committee of the UN, for example, has warned that any curbs must be necessary and proportionate and shouldn't jeopardise the right itself. Now, where you've got restricted entry to foreign journalists, where you've got restricted entry to medics, where you've got restricted entry to any kind of observers at all, that will not be compatible with Article 19.3. So you straight away there have had a problem for a long time, but you had a very specific problem in the context of where you've got. My view as an international human rights lawyer is that there is no doubt that India's treatment of Kashmir, both pre and post August of 19, shows that it's in violation of its obligation, many obligations under international law. So what have the UN said about this in recent times? And just a precursor to that, there has been an attempt this evening to try to keep the politics and the human rights separate. As a lawyer, I think it's very important that we do keep it separate, because there is a space in which you can talk about human rights violations which is completely clear. It is a violation, full stop. That doesn't need to be messied in a way by the complexities of regional dialogue and politics. And so from my point of view, to ensure that there is adequate redress quickly and necessarily, to make sure that there isn't an ongoing state of impunity, states, the international community, need to be prepared to call out the international law and human rights, even if they're not prepared to take a particular stance on politics. That, for me, I think that's crystal clear. Now, the UN has mobilised, just even in the last few months, to make a number of really serious statements of concern. So first of all, well, just pre-last August, in June 2018, so before the current crisis emerged, the Office of the High Commissioner issued a detailed 49-page report which highlighted human rights violations and abuse, I should say, on both sides of the line of control. And they highlighted a situation of chronic impunity for violations committed by security forces. Since about 2016, the High Commissioner for Human Rights has on numerous occasions asked both governments for unconditional access to Kashmir to assess the human rights situation. India has point blank refused. Pakistan has offered access if India grants access. So we're stuck, unfortunately, in a situation without unconditional access to Kashmir. I think that's problematic, but nevertheless, the Office of the High Commissioner stated that it would then have to undertake remote monitoring. So that's what it did. It came out with a really detailed report. And I'd just like to quote one bit of it. The political dimensions of the dispute between India and Pakistan have long been centre stage, but this is not a conflict frozen in time. It's a conflict that has robbed millions of their basic human rights and continues to do so to untold human suffering. And then High Commissioner Sayeed said that that's why he would urge the Human Rights Council to consider a commission of inquiry to conduct a comprehensive international investigation into allegations of human rights in Kashmir. Now, at that point, that related to the violence that had erupted in 2016. And there is, as the High Commissioner, as Your Excellency says, a long reported history, and in fact, you've shown me also the large number of reports on this ground. Baroness Kennedy has spoken about some of these, and I won't repeat any of that. But then last October, so just a couple of months ago, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights urged the Indian government, and she used the words unlock the situation because of the deprivation of the basic freedoms. The UN Special Rapporteurs, 5 UN Special Rapporteurs, so literally across that range of basic freedoms that we take for granted as fundamental rights, made a statement about the shutdown of internet communications, and they said that they were inconsistent, or this internet shutdown, this comms shutdown, was inconsistent with fundamental norms of necessity and proportionality. It's a form of, and I quote, collective punishment of the people of Jammu and Kashmir without even a pretext of a precipitating offence. That is really stark language from the Special Rapporteurs. And they specifically reminded the government of India that the restrictions were intrinsically disproportionate because they precluded considerations of the specific circumstances of each proposed assembly. Now, there's lots of detail in that statement, so if you're interested, you should definitely read it. I think, however, what's happened domestically in India has sort of overtaken all of that, because I say overtaken, that's probably putting a sort of spin of wish on the whole thing, because lawyers in India were mobilised very, very quickly in response to the Kashmir crisis, and they lodged petitions in the Supreme Court on the abrogation itself of Jammu Kashmir Article 370, and then there were numerous cases filed on the habeas corpus, so the arrest and detention and disappearance of people, and also on the internet communication shutdown. And the case was argued incredibly slowly. Now, the wheels of justice in the subcontinent do spin unbelievably slowly. That is a reality, and it impedes justice taking place. But in this case, this was a sort of mass emergency of the scale, the scale and disproportionality of the shutdown was huge. It was properly argued until the end of last year. Given that we're talking about including habeas corpus applications, given that we're talking about extensive communications blackout, that was simply not fast enough. In any event, the judgment came out on the 10th of January. And it was a really interesting 100-something page judgment.
Just a few weeks ago.
Last week. And it's a really long, typical Indian Supreme Court judgment, 100+ pages, which is actually in many ways a celebration of the right to expression. It underlines that the right to have internet access and telecommunications is a fundamental right guaranteed by the Indian Constitution. When you read it, it looks like a triumph of fundamental rights. It looks like a triumph for the Indian Constitution. You read it and you read it and you read it, and then you get to the end and nothing happens. And it is quite bizarre, and possibly one of the strangest judgments I've read from any Supreme Court, never mind the Indian Supreme Court. It just says all these marvellous things about fundamental rights, so that if this were to happen again, you would be able to look back at this judgment and say, these are our rights, right here now.
It doesn't say this has to stop now.
It simply doesn't grant relief. It's an application for judicial review in which the Supreme Court simply avoids granting relief. What they do is they say, this should now be reviewed, and the government has the opportunity to review it. And that's
we're
it.
telling them how it should be, how things ought to be.
But they haven't stopped it.
Yeah.
This is absolutely incredible. So what you now have is, for example, today, the arguments on the abrogation of Article 370 were resumed. Tomorrow, the first arguments on the Citizenship Amendment Act begin, constitutionality of that, discriminatory provisions of that. But what we're seeing is a court that's taking a very long time and actually not taking the final, not being brave enough in the end to make the decision. That is deeply, deeply problematic, because India has a long history of constitutional support from its apex court. This suggests that there is a problem.
But they're kind.
And they are terrified, and they don't want to make that. Now that, I think, bodes very, very badly for these other challenges that are to follow. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't judges brave enough, because there certainly are judges brave enough on that bench to be able to make the decision. But what we see is 5 months later, the principles have been laid out. What's the response on the ground? Well, Human Rights Watch are saying, and they're the only organisation that I think has had a relatively detailed input of what's going on. They also are not formally allowed to go in, but they are gathering information in the best way that they can. What they say in the last 10 days since the judgment is there has been a minor relaxation of that, because the principles of internet freedom and communications freedom are so set out. But what seems to have happened is that in some places, government kiosks have opened, for example, where people have to, bust themselves 100 kilometres or something to get there. Thousands of people are trying to get to these 1 or 2 kiosks. There's no prospect of you getting in. And in any event, half of the websites are blocked for national security reasons. So whilst the government is busy reviewing its own orders and working out whether what it's done is unconstitutional or not, a job that the Supreme Court should have done for it, there are these sort of limited inroads. Some people seem to have been released. But of course we can't know how many, because the government, and the government of Jammu and Kashmir, has never actually set out the names and numbers of the people who've been detained. So one of the things that I and the former chair of the Bar Council asked the Government of India to do was to set out the names of the people and the numbers of the people who've been detained. We didn't receive any response to that, which I thought was really quite surprising. It was sent to the Indian High Commissioner, it was sent to Prime Minister Modi himself. I want to just raise one other thing before I stop, which is that Baroness Warsi, or I think it may have been Mr. Baker, one of the early speakers said, you know, that if India wants, I think it was Steve Baker, if India wants a place on the UN Security Council, if it wants a place in the global community, then India has to understand that the global community won't tolerate that. One of the things that has emerged, and I can't back this up, so I say this without I can't tell you whether this is true or not, but one of the rumours that I have been hearing from a number of sources is that some of the boys who were detained in Kashmir have been sent to sort of what are called de-radicalisation camps. Now, this has kind of been emerging, and no one can prove it as yet. What is so worrying about the state of affairs is, and you know, when politicians say, well, you know, the global community won't tolerate a country that breaches the norms of international law to this degree, I'm afraid we have sitting on the Security Council China, who has, in a very extreme way, interned 1 million people in extreme camps, and nobody's saying anything. So we have a problem. I just wanted to say something about international law. We have a problem with politicians selectively choosing to rely on international law. This is across the world. This is not necessarily a specific criticism of this country, when it suits them. And the problem is, if we're going to use that argument, it won't work if we allow it in one place and don't allow it in another. So what there needs to be, I think, in order for pressure to be properly placed, there needs to be a commitment to international law, to the norms of international law, and to the enforcement of international law. And in this case, what that means is the establishment of a UN fact-finding mission, which is not a 1 or 2 day thing for someone to go in, but a lengthy UN fact-finding mission of the kind that they've had before, that will go in over a long period, over a very wide-ranging area, so not 1 village or 2 villages in particular, where they are sufficiently, and there are many lawyers and many fact-finders who are able to create a proper pattern of events, because they can do it, they've done it in numerous other countries, including war zones, genocidal regions. That has to happen, and governments across the world, not just on their own. I don't think it's much use for the UK on its own to say, well, we believe in international law, and this is what should happen. Join forces, take France, take Germany, take the EU. Actually, there is movement in America. There has been movement in America. There's been movement against the weak camps, there's been movement. There might be different political reasons for it, but there is the beginnings of something that can be used to say, we don't tolerate these kind of breaches. So I'll be quiet now. I haven't said anything about the CAA or NRC, but these issues are all linked. Thank you.
Withdrawn from the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And so that kind of really has been a rather undermining of confidence, not just there, inside that body, but generally people are sort of therefore feeling rather kind of more, they can swagger in their impunity. And so that's one of the problems just now, is that you don't have, if you like, a shared commitment to international law. The international law is being undermined and being undermined in a way that we should find, wholly egregious. And that's one of the problems here, is that people are remaining silent because of that. Now, we know that in some ways you're right, that some people, when they're dealing with the Palestinians, when they're dealing with black people in America, whatever, they will not feel that they're dealing with human beings like themselves. They somehow have a hierarchy of what they think is truly human. We don't accept that. The whole point of the universalism of human rights is that we recognise the dignity and the humanity of each and every one of us. And we have to reassert that, and the world has to hear that message over and over again. That the UN, High Commissioner Zaid, somebody that we know well, a good man, has worked hard on this and is continuing to do so. I do believe that there are voices being raised in relation to this, and we just have to make them louder, and we also have to have if they can have coalitions of the willing for war, we can have coalitions of willing for the protection of human rights, and that's what we have to do. Please, I'm going to ask.
I believe that this attempt of an illegal annexation to change the demography of the occupied Kashmir through threat or use of force in contravention of the Fourth Geneva Convention, I believe that the Barbary Masjid verdict of a heritage mosque being given by the Supreme Court to be converted into a temple, and the CA and the Assam Register are actually part of a systematic attempt by a majoritarian government to vilify the rights of minorities, and I think it's very alarming and important that I completely endorse what Joanna Shawley QC said, that we require a global order, that we want states to come together to enforce implementation of human rights law, of human rights treaties and conventions that protect the rights of citizens. And I think human rights, as you have been propagating for many years, and you just said, are universal in nature. I mean, it is not really a dispute between two countries.
There is something that most of us are kind of almost unwilling to express, which is the fact that there is a general thing happening everywhere, which is an assault upon Islam. Certainly the sense that one's getting just now is religious nationalism, which was being expressed, I think, by Stephen Mitchell. A concern about the rise of religious nationalism, and religious nationalism anywhere. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's very important for Pakistan to be protective of minorities, and of course, people here in Britain, and I hear them in the House of Lords and in the Commons, express concerns that Pakistan is not being protective enough of the rights of minorities too. So, it's very important that you don't speak with forked tongues. You have to have a position which is, I don't like this happening in my own country, and I don't like it happening over there either. So it is important that Pakistan's voice of government becomes stronger on seeking to address some of those issues internally.
I just say one thing, that first of all, I think we have put in a lot of effort to highlight the human rights violations which are going on. We have a tradition of issuing a press release, so I will be issuing a press release about this event. Secondly, because it is my moral responsibility to inform everyone who is present here. Secondly, you mentioned about, yes, there are concerns about human violation in Pakistan, but the difference where you're drawing a comparison is that state is not actually encouraging that. These are the individuals.
I think there might be a dispute about that, if I'm honest.
Yes.
Especially when you start to think about blasphemy laws and you start to look at blasphemy laws, for example, our state laws. It's a big issue.
I know, but blasphemy is not actually, this law is in many countries. It is not specific or discriminatory in terms against any community, religious community.
But I think that the freedom of religion and religious expression is vitally important, and you're talking about it just now in relation to what's happening to people in Kashmir when it comes to holidays and their carrying out of their religious duties and so forth, and the inhibitions on that.
First of all, I'm not going to speak for very long. I think, Helena, you've encompassed it beautifully, and I think the question in the House of Lords yesterday really covered a whole series of issues around the problems that we currently have in Kashmir. And I completely agree with you that there are two issues here. There is the political issue about territorial integrity and a long-term political solution to what that part of the world will look like, and we can all have differences of opinions on what that will be. But I think what my interest is, and probably the interest of most of the panellists on here, is that until disputes are resolved, political disputes, wherever they may happen to be in the world, it's important that we preserve human rights, or the human rights of the people who make up that nation, until the time that political leaders can possibly, potentially resolve the wider political issue. And something that many of us, I think for many years, have been raising is the human rights situation. I mean, what we're seeing now is an extreme manifestation of the problem there, but the problem has been there for many years. So the issue of blinding of young people in Kashmir, the use of sexual violence, what I call sexual warfare in Kashmir is well documented. The issue of disappearances, extrajudicial killing. What we're now beginning to see is much of that which has been denied in the past is now being done in such a way and with such high profile people such as ex-chief ministers that it's almost impossible now to try and hide the situation. And I think where the politics has disturbingly developed in more recent times is that there appears now to be a justification for this. So before it was a case of we're trying to resolve these issues and we're trying to demilitarize and we're trying, but now it's a sense of, look, this is none of your business. You know, this is a domestic issue. We've now changed the constitution, and therefore somehow that gives us a green light to behave in whatever way we want to. And I think some of the language that's come out of parliamentarians who've spoken about this issue, including specific language around women, around threatening sexual violence, around misogyny, to me, I think it is deeply disturbing. We have a unique role to play. Look, I was in the Foreign Office for many, many years. I know what the Foreign Office line is, both under the last Labour government, but also under a Conservative government, under a coalition government, which is that we want the two countries to sit together and deal with this matter bilaterally, in accordance with the wishes of the Kashmiri people. Well, right now, the wishes of the Kashmiri people are to be treated with dignity and respect, and for them not to have their human rights violated. So when there is clearly a case where the wishes of the basic peace of the Kashmiri people no longer prevails, I feel that we have a responsibility as good friends of India and of Pakistan to be part of this process and to say to India, who fashions itself for wanting to be part of the international community, including with aspirations for membership of the United Nations, that you cannot have such aspirations and you cannot be, unfortunately, you cannot be an international global member of the global community if you choose not to live by the rules of the international global community, including rights entrenched in the UN Charter. So I think that's all I want to say. I think this is an issue which is relevant because it's an important human rights issue. It's an issue that's relevant because I think Britain has and always has had skin in the game, and therefore we're wrong to deny that we don't. But most importantly, it continues to be an issue because many, many of our fellow British citizens have family and friends and connections in that part of the world, and for them this is a daily reality of the turmoil and the trauma that they are going through and their families are going through. So Helena, thank you so much for hosting this, and the High Commissioner for supporting it, and parliamentary colleagues again for supporting it.
Who represent Kashmiris, the population is sufficiently large. We're always going to have just a few of us who represent diaspora communities, and we'll have to do the very best we can. But I do think we need to widen the agenda, because you rightly said tonight we're not talking about the territorial issue, but I think when we stand on the human rights issue, we're on the moral high ground, and there can be no dispute over some of these issues, blinding people, rape and other sexual violence. There can be no dispute that these things are wrong, that they're wicked. But I'm very alarmed by the India Citizenship Amendment Act. I started to ask myself, well, hang on, what's going on here on the ground? Because of course we naturally focus on Kashmir, but I'm very concerned about religious nationalism. Now, in addition to the larger Kashmiri population that I represent, I also do represent some Indian people, and they've started being, I think, deliberately provoked in some cases, but they've started being alarmed that I speak up for Kashmir, and I've explained to them that if it was their families subjected to the same human rights abuses, I'd be just as vocal, elevated, outraged on behalf of them. It's not about their religion or their country, it's about the treatment of people. But it has to be said, if India abandons a secular state, if India abandons freedom of religion, if it is seen to make incursions into those things, then the whole world will be poorer for it because of the sheer scale of India. And I'm afraid I think we might need to start saying more against religious nationalism and in favour of tolerance and freedom of religion, and how that then plays into the persecutions that we're seeing of various religious minorities in different parts of the subcontinent, but in particular, of course, Kashmir. I intervened on the Foreign Secretary in the Queen's Speech debate to make the point to him that foreign policy is not adequately responsive. There was some laughter in the chamber from the Labour side from people who've been in the Foreign Office. Foreign policy is not adequately responsive to diaspora communities. To me, it's not on in a democracy that foreign policy survives from one party to the next without changing, without responding either to the change of minister or to the obvious concerns of populations from various parts of the world, and in particular Kashmir.
Please, would you tell us your name and your constituency and tell us all about it?
Yes, Imran said Bradford East. Can I also thank you? I'm just going to build on one of the points my colleagues here have made. I think the first point of which I do want to welcome, we do have here today members of the Bar and the Chair of the International Human Rights Commission at the Bar as well. And I think I'm just going to add a few points within the legal context as well, which I think today was focusing on as well. I was at this morning at the AGM for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Kashmir, which I'm Senior Vice Chair of, and the point was made there, and somebody said, are you impartial to one side? So let me make it absolutely clear. I think, as Stephen just said, we as parliamentarians are friends of India and Pakistan. I think this is not an issue around India or Pakistan. This is an issue of human rights violations and abuses, and it has to be stated on every occasion. It's tragic that we have to state that on every occasion, but I think that distinction has to be made, in particular given this meeting here today, and in particular given the legal context of it. And colleagues have gone into the persecution, oppression and injustice, which, if I can add, didn't start last year or a decade ago, has actually started since decades ago now, when the Kashmiris have effectively been under siege in that region, and human rights abuses and violations to some degree have been taking place. But if you put that into a legal context, and you mentioned earlier, if we look at the mechanisms used to apply the human rights violations, so take for example the Public Safety Act, take for example the Special Powers Act, these are both legislation that are draconian in nature and are recognised in international law as not only draconian but in direct convention of international law. We then move on to the situation that we saw recently with Article 370 and 35A. Again, this legislation has been questioned domestically within the Indian Constitution. There is a very strong case against it within the Indian Constitution. If we move further on, it directly contravenes international legislation. It's directly in contravention of United Nations resolutions, and we now, Stephen refers to the Citizens Amendment Act that we've seen most recently, which is subject to much legal discussion among sensible people in India at the moment. And then we have answers where we come back to our government, and it's true, my colleagues are absolutely right, this is true of any government of any stripe, so, I think we are all agreed that this is above party politics in this country. But we go back and we fail to see simple condemnation of areas where the legality is in question. We see simple condemnation, and myself included, but many other colleagues have often stood up in the House and asked for a simple condemnation, a simple acknowledgement that this is illegal and they should condemn this, and we failed to even get those. And I know Qurban was asking the question in the boards yesterday morning, I believe, along with other colleagues. So one has to question the sincerity of this. And of course, successive governments will say that, revert back to the issue. And I think Baroness Warsi is absolutely right. Where the playing field has changed tragically in the wrong direction is this. There now seems to be not even a cover-up of sorts. There now seems to be a blatant response back, which is this is an internal issue. Well, I'm sorry, but human rights issues are not, internal issues. Issues where legislation or the mechanisms used to commit human rights abuses are not internal issues. They are international issues. And the government here needs to, I believe, government when it's right, needs to be very, very clear. You cannot have a block answer that says this is a bilateral issue.
Totally in contravention of the code. So I want to then turn to my other colleague who's here from Dewsbury.
So I'm Mark Eastwood from Dewsbury.
Dewsbury.
Yeah. So I don't know if you're aware of Dewsbury. Near
I know about Dewsbury. I once represented somebody from Dewsbury.
Indeed. We've got a huge Kashmiri population in Dewsbury. What I found actually is we also have an Indian Muslim population, Gujarati, and I think this issue transcends the national boundaries, like between India and obviously Pakistan and Kashmir. And I think it's the issue with human rights has been centre to this. And actually, in terms of political differences, I think it does transcend political boundaries, and I think Imran's already mentioned that. So it doesn't matter if you wear a red badge, a blue badge, yellow badge, not any of those. And see for myself what's happening over there. Now I understand there might be problems getting to Jammu and Kashmir, but I would go to Azad Kashmir and get the stories and see for myself. And I think that's really important.